Munich, November 8th. This city, with tens of thousands of German visitors and several thousand more Nazi stormtroopers, is celebrating today and tomorrow a political miracle. The miracle is the resurrection of the National Socialist Party of Adolf Hitler and its marvelous endurance and growth, until at length it has swept over all Germany. And within Germany, its power is limitless. 10 years ago tomorrow, it was killed. So it then seemed, as dead as anything political could be, in battle and amid bloodshed. Its main leader was a fugitive with capture and a prison term ahead of him. Today, he is Chancellor of the Reich, and untold thousands hang upon his slightest word. That, David, is the somewhat chilling opening paragraph of an article published in the New York Times in 1933, the year the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. But it's about what happened in Germany a decade earlier, in 1923, when Hitler attempted to win power violently through an attempted coup launched in the city of Munich, the so-called beer hall putsch. I'm Sarah Churchwell, and welcome to Journey Through Time.
And I'm David Olusoga, and we wanted to take a couple of episodes to look at the beer hall putsch, an event that lasts less than 24 hours, and yet in that tiny time frame takes place a critical event that shapes the rest of the 20th century.
Indeed, and it is really a crossroads, isn't it? It's a fork in the road where things could have turned out differently in two directions, right? Hitler could have succeeded right then and taken power at that moment, or his failure could have been complete. But that isn't what happened, is it?
No, there were many moments when Hitler and the Nazis could have been stopped. This is the moment when they really should have been stopped, when the state should have acted in the way that it needed to actually repress and crush the Nazi party and the movement. And all they would have needed to have done is to apply the law to him the way they applied it to other people. But we'll get on to that. Yeah. The other thing we wanted to do is to set it within the social history of Germany in 1923, because without that, it's difficult to understand why anyone listened to this beer hall agitator. Hitler was not the figure of the 1930s. He was this local politician, this agitator, this aggressive figure who spoke in beer halls. What made people listen was the conditions that they were living in. 23 is the year of hyperinflation. There's a great book on this called The Year Money Dies, which I think explains what happened. It was also a year of invasion by France and Belgium to force Germany to pay the reparations from the First World War. That invasion is what causes the hyperinflation. And without understanding what that does to ordinary people in their lives, we can't understand why it is that people who might not have dreamed of supporting the Nazis, or indeed the communists, as many people did, turned to the fringes, to the extremes of German politics.
It's chaos that does that, isn't it? Often, crisis and chaos in the sense that the previous order, the status quo just isn't working, that everything is collapsing. And then you start to look for alternative solutions.
Yeah. And sometimes those alternatives is who will defend me from the other extreme. So people are pushed to the extremes at this moment in 1923. But the putsch itself, the event that we're going to unpack, is an absolute farce. And we have to sort of balance the seriousness of the politics and the history and just what an amateur hour revolution this is. I mean, it is truly laughable at times. And people at the time thought it was shambolic.
But that sense that it was a farce and that it was comedy is part of the reason why people didn't take it seriously.
Yeah. And that's the danger. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the putsch itself. And in the next episode, we're going to explain in some ways the hardest thing to explain, which is how Hitler turned a catastrophe into a propaganda triumph. Because as we said, this should have been the end of any possibility of Hitler becoming a leader and the Nazi Party becoming a serious political force. And we'll also look at how the events of 1923 were later reimagined and repackaged by the Nazis to become not a farce and a kind of shambolic mess, but this sacred, solemn event that they would reenact every year after 1933 in this kind of cult-like way.
It really gets into the heart of that word that you mentioned a minute ago, David, of propaganda, and the way that propaganda started to work for Hitler and for the Nazi Party. I mean, they were really masters at rewriting their own history using propaganda to transform weakness into strength, right? They did that over and over again. And this is one of those key moments where they're going to take failure and turn it into the foundation of success.
And I think it's a difference between that Nazi party in the 30s, in charge with the power of the state behind it, and this party of 1923 that we need to understand. This is a very, very different party back in the early 20s. We need to put out of our minds all of those huge gatherings at Nuremberg and the rallies. This is a tiny little party, not anything special. There are lots of parties like it.
And I think that's really one of the values of looking at this specific moment, because it really brings home how if things had played out differently, the Nazi Party that we know would not have come into existence. I mean, going back to the origin, you really see very clearly how it could have turned out differently, how easily it could have turned out differently.
Yeah, there are dozens of far-right parties that emerge in Germany at this time that most people have never heard of. You have to go looking into the history of this moment to find their names. There's dozens and dozens of them. But this is an era of political assassination. This is an era in which parties are not just political parties, they also have paramilitary wings. Many of these parties are formed from the groups of soldiers that come together in what is effectively a civil war in 1918, 1919 in Germany, the so-called Freikorps, the kind of Wagner group of their day. And the Nazi Party are also a local party. Our image of them is of a national party. They're a Bavarian party in one of the German states.
Yeah. So we associate Hitler with Berlin, of course, and with all of the architecture of Berlin. But this is Munich. We're in Munich for this story, and we need to remember that the politics here are about Munich politicians and far-right parties and their resentment of Berlin, right? So we're squarely in Munich right now.
The most conservative of the German states that is very antagonistic towards Prussia to the north, which is capital is Berlin. Berlin's obviously also the capital of Germany, but that is the most liberal state, and Bavaria is the most conservative. The other thing we need to obviously explain here is that we are in the aftermath of the First World War, which ends, of course, with the Treaty of Versailles. Just to kind of run through the terms of that somewhat infamous treaty. Germany loses 13% of its territory, 10% of its population. It is stripped of its overseas colonies, quite rightly in my view. Its army is not allowed to exceed 100,000 men, and it can have no tanks, no aircraft, or no submarines. This is a hated treaty, but the most hated part is Article 231 that says Germany is alone responsible for the war, the so-called war guilt.
And this is such an important part of the Treaty of Versailles, isn't it? And I think that it's worth noting that even at the time, people understood that it was a dangerous set of impositions, right? That, that this country where the national pride was already battered in defeat. And then you're going to have these punitive measures that, they saw as humiliating. Many people saw it as vengeful. And it wasn't just the Germans who saw it as vengeful, right? I mean, there were critics in the Allied countries who said, this seems almost engineered to provoke resentment, guys. like maybe this isn't going to rebuild stability. And, even at the time they were saying this is a powder keg. You are lighting a powder keg. But the leaders didn't listen. And this is exactly what they imposed on Germany. And that resentment did build.
There were two elements to this story. There's the terms of the Versailles Treaty, as you say, considered to be excessive by many people, not just in Germany. The British trade union movement appealed against the terms and actually raised money to send to Germany. But the other element is the way the war had ended. When the war ended, Germany still had control of the Eastern Front. They had defeated the Russians back in 1917. They were still in possession of huge areas of France and Belgium. So you could, if you really wanted to, say this is an army that had not been defeated. It still possessed, it still had its forces on enemy territory. So the argument is developed, is confected, that the army had not been militarily defeated. It had been stabbed in the back. That is the great lie, the big myth, that the civilian government, dominated in the view of the far right by socialists and by Jews, had betrayed the German people and the German army. So you have a treaty that imposes the draconian terms, and you have this myth that Germany hadn't really lost.
And what they're saying is that we were defeated on the home front by these traitors from within, but we won the battle on the battlefield.
Yeah. So the real enemy is not the French and the British and the Americans, the old enemy from the First World War. The real enemy is this civilian democratic government in Berlin, in the minds of many people who are on the right and the far right of German politics.
And they had betrayed Germany. They were the real traitors. And therefore, you have to go root those people out from your own country rather than fighting an external enemy.
And on top of that, this is also about a new form of government to Germany, which is democracy. Proper parliamentary representative democracy, not democracy dominated by a Kaiser, as we'd had before 1914. So a new system of government, a hated treaty, and a toxic myth of Germany being undefeated. That's the sort of background from 1918 up to 1923. But 1923, the year of the putsch, 5 years later, is itself a year of incredible crisis. And it's like the volume is turned up on all of this that year.
Right. So in the intervening 5 years, far from getting settled, as you say, the crisis has just been deepening.
There have been revolutions. There had been risings, one of them in Munich in 1918. But in 1923, Germany has fallen behind with the reparations it has to pay as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And the French and the Belgians marched their army into the Ruhr, 100,000 soldiers, to force Germany to pay its reparations. Now, this is not really about money. This is about coal. It's about telegraph poles. Germany is invaded because it's not generating enough telegraph poles to send to France and Belgium. And what this sparks is this incredible wave of nationalism, and in some ways kind of righteous nationalism. The workers in the Ruhr, the part of Germany that is invaded, where 80% of the coal, iron and steel came from, they go on strike. So France has gone in demanding that more coal is sent to France, demanding these telegraph poles are sent to France. The workers are on strike. In order to support the strike, the government decides to print money. That leads to the legendary hyperinflation of 1923.
The stories about hyperinflation in this period they can be a little bit hard to get your head around, right? Because the numbers are mind-boggling.
Yeah. And some of the numbers are important, but they don't get across what it means to people. I mean, to go through the numbers. In July, a US dollar was worth 350,000 German marks. By August, you had to pay 1 million marks to
get
buy
a dollar.
A single dollar, $1. By November, it took billions of marks to buy a single dollar. And by the end of the year, it took 6.7 trillion marks to buy a single dollar. Now, that's a blizzard of numbers and zeros. What it means is your savings are worth nothing. Mm. All of the wealth that you generated, all of that work, businesses, family companies, savings, all of that is gone.
Mm. And what's worth also, pointing out that using that dollar as the benchmark, right? This is literally why so many Americans went to Europe in the early 1920s on the strength of the post-war dollar, because they could pay for anything, right, with those dollars.
One of the things that's most resented in the hyperinflation is foreigners coming to Germany and being able, with a handful of dollars or pounds, to buy property in German cities. I mean, there is terrible profiteering, which is deeply, deeply resented. But that sense that you'd done all the right things. You'd worked hard, you'd saved, you'd bought property, set up businesses, and it is now worth nothing.
There's one story I think that really brings it home to me, because as you say, the numbers get a little bit abstract. But there's a story about these two women in Berlin in 1923, so the year of the putsch, and they go to the bank with a basket filled with banknotes. And they set it down, they get distracted. They set it down for a minute, they turn back, and all of the money is still there, but the basket is gone. They can use the basket, but they can't use the piles of banknotes. Yeah, isn't that amazing? The basket is worth something.
Yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of stories. I mean, there are people, you go into a restaurant and you look at the prices and you order food, and it's double the cost by the time you get your bill, because in the hour you've been eating, inflation has gone.
And it sounds like legends, right? It sounds like we're cracking jokes, but this is literally what was happening to people. And so there's nothing funny about it when you're living through it.
Yeah. I mean, as we'll get on to, there are printing presses around Germany, almost 2,000 of them, some of them working round the clock, printing new German marks, because the currency of a few days ago is not valuable enough, hasn't got enough zeros on it to actually allow anyone to buy anything.
So this is a national problem, hyperinflation, and it is creating a national collapse. But Bavaria responds slightly differently, doesn't it? Munich takes a different path from the rest of the country.
There are uprisings, there is violence, there is disorder all over the country. In September 1923, the government of Bavaria proclaims a state of emergency. And a man called Gustav Ritter von Kahr is given the power of General State Commissar. He's basically allowed to be a dictator.
He's a dictator, yeah.
These are emergency powers, and this is a national emergency. And Kahr and the leadership of the army really hate the Weimar government, the civilian government.
In Berlin.
Kahr is a right-wing politician. He's also a jurist. He is not somebody who is averse to the idea of the civilian government being toppled. But he is far, far more realistic, as we're going to find out, than Adolf Hitler, who has emerged in 1921 in Munich. Kahr and Hitler are constantly criticizing each other. Hitler's having mass rallies. He's one of the few people who can fill the big beer halls, the beer cellars of Munich. And there's constant tension between Gustav Ritter von Kahr and Adolf Hitler because they're both vying for power in Munich. And Kahr is in secret talks with other forces on the nationalist far right of German politics. He's in talks with the army, he's in talks with the police, he's in talks with other politicians, and they are considering launching a coup of their own, of using Munich as a base, a nationalist conservative state, and from there marching on Berlin. And we'll get to why this idea of the march on Berlin is in everyone's mind.
So basically, Munich is a kind of hotbed of anti-Berlin sentiment at the moment, right? And we've got all these little groups that are basically contemplating a coup and wondering if they can topple the Berlin government. And the Nazis are one of the parties that has suddenly thought, hang on, maybe we could take over.
And they're probably the party that's benefiting most from the chaos in Bavaria in 1923. They start that year with just 8,000 members. By the putsch in November, they have 55,000 members. And Hitler, who just thrives on chaos, he is using this moment to just wind up the people of Munich and Bavaria. He's giving speeches constantly. He is saying that violence and revolution are the only solutions to Germany's problems. He's saying that it's imminent, it's coming, the storm is on its way. And by November, the party members and the SA, the paramilitary force that's part of the Nazi party, who later became the Brown Shirts, they are just they've been brought up to a kind of fever pitch. There is this mentality that is created in part by Hitler, but it's also a feature of the movement itself, which it needs to keep moving forward. It needs action. It needs to push and to push events towards some sort of crisis. I mean, historians have compared the party to a shark. If it stops swimming, it will drown.
Yeah.
It needs to keep getting ever more radical, ever more violent, ever more aggressive.
And that's very much Hitler's mindset too, isn't it? So he's fully in this mode at this moment of, this is our chance. We need to seize our moment.
It's now or never.
It's now or never. I think at that moment is the time for us to take a break. And when we come back, we will hear how the beer hall putsch itself actually began. So welcome back. Now, we're about to tell the story of the beer hall putsch of 1923, also known as the Munich putsch. But before we get into what happens on that day, we really need to say a little bit more about Adolf Hitler, don't we? Because we've been talking about him. We don't have to explain who Hitler was. But in 1923, he is not the person that we know from a decade later.
He's not. And when the Nazis come to power, they stage manage everything and they create myths. And this is one of the myths they're going to create. But they generate the image of Hitler that we now think of. This is a very different figure in 1923. He's 34 years old. He's a veteran of the First World War. He's fought on the Western Front. He has the Iron Cross. But he is not somebody who is convinced yet that he is the great leader. He's beginning to think that maybe he is the man of destiny who could lead Germany. But he's often vacillating between that idea and another idea, which is he is the drummer, as he calls himself, der Strummer.
So the drummer is like drumming them up, right?
Yeah.
Like rallying the troops. But in practice, for Hitler, that meant propaganda, right? That's what he was really doing. He was the master of publicity. And so he could rally the troops by drumming up the emotions and drumming up the crowds, drumming up the mobs through propaganda.
Hitler had worked out at some point in 1919, 1920, that he had one great skill in life. And no matter what we say about Hitler, he was quite clearly, by almost every account, an astonishing, perhaps even a unique public speaker. Most of the people who follow him because they went to a beer cellar one day and this man was on stage. And there is something which is very hard to describe and very hard to account for about his ability to make people stop thinking and emote instead.
But it's also the case that we were talking about the ways in which his, the conditions around him were ripe for his rise. And one of them, of course, is that modern propaganda, as we understand it, comes out of the First World War. So he, as a corporal on the Western Front, he starts to see these techniques, as everybody does, and he starts to realize this is something that he can do. And after the war, it becomes his skill set.
Yeah. He's an astonishing public speaker. He's also somebody who understands the idea of visual branding, the idea of the power, the impact of the visual, the impact of the modern. I mean, one of the things about Hitler is he's never photographed on a horse. He's photographed beside aeroplanes and beside cars. It's about being modern and not being of the old order. But this is somebody who's kind of stumbling towards that person, that Führer that he's going to become. He is increasing his contacts among the elite in Bavaria. He is gathering supporters. He's a strange figure. He's socially awkward. I mean, he is a working class Austrian. His citizenship is another thing we need to discuss in the story, because he's not German, which makes it even stranger. He wears an odd costume as well. He wears a trench coat at this point. He carries a dog whip for some reason.
He had a collection of them, didn't he? He had several dog whips, and he would choose which dog whip he was going to use.
Yeah, there's an odd whip thing going on.
Which we don't need to get into.
With Adolf. And lots of the accounts of people who meet him, I mean, they're loaded in social snobbery. He's meeting influential, wealthy Bavarians who kind of describe him as this kind of funny little working class man who doesn't know how to use knives and forks. It's really quite ugly. His suits don't fit. His table manners are wrong. But my God, he is a unique orator. One of the people whose account is exactly like that is a guy called Ernst Hanfstaengl, who was an American.
Yeah, he's part American, and he is to the manner born, right? So he's also he represents a lot of what Hitler aspires to. So everybody knows that Hitler is a failed painter and wanted to be a great artist. And I always get I can never pronounce his name though. It's Hanfstaengl. I say it and then it doesn't come out of my mouth. It's
Hanfstaengl or Hanfstaengl. I don't know. My German is terrible.
Yeah, me too. So, but Hanfstaengl, I can't say it. Hanfstaengl.
But Putzi, we call it Putzi, which was his nickname.
Or Ernst. I can say Ernst. He was very high up in the art world. He was very, very knowledgeable about art, and that was one of the things that Hitler enjoyed about.
He was a great pianist, and he could play Wagner, and Hitler would march around while he played the Valkyries and Lohengrin. And he was this cultural figure, this connected figure. He was also married to a very beautiful woman, Helena, his wife. And Hitler was somewhat infatuated with her. And he opened lots of doors for Hitler in the elite. So the influence of the party is growing. Hitler's becoming a bigger figure. He's got people with money and influence behind him. There's some very wealthy, very influential, very famous Germans, publishers, the owners of big companies, giving money to the party at this point. I won't name any companies, but there are companies that still exist today that are supporting the party at this point. And Hitler is beginning to move away from this idea of being the drummer and think of himself as the leader. And that's partly because of what had happened the previous year, 1922, in Italy.
Yeah, I was going to say, so he's not just looking at German influences, right? Part of his thinking is that there has been a big change next door by somebody who calls himself the leader.
In lots of external ways, presentational ways, German National Socialism is a tribute act to Italian fascism.
It's a great phrase. It's exactly right.
The fascists have their black shirts. The SA are going to become the brown shirts. The charismatic leader with complete authority, that idea comes out of fascism. El Duce in Germany, it becomes the Führer.
And he's literally leader in both.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a strict copycat. Yeah.
And the Nazi salute is adopted from the fascist salute, which they claim is adopted from ancient Rome. I would talk to Mary Beard about this.
Exactly.
It seems more likely that it was adapted from French neoclassical artistic depictions of ancient Rome, like Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Hierarchy, where the three figures, the three sons of Horatio, have their arms up when what looks like a Nazi salute.
Well, it's true for a lot of our nationalist myths in Anglo-American culture too, isn't it? All the things that we think are ancient are actually invented in the 19th century.
Yeah.
They always are.
But they like this idea that they are the new Rome, and they have the eagle like the Roman standard. They're going to nick loads of stuff, not just from the fascists, but from Rome. But the really exciting thing about fascism, if you are Hitler sitting in a beer keller in Munich in 1923, is that it had worked.
It's a roadmap to power, right? You can see that it succeeded, and it succeeded recently. Yeah. It just worked.
Because just a few months earlier, October 1922, Mussolini and 20,000 of his fascists had marched on Rome, and the king had capitulated. He had eventually appointed Mussolini prime minister of Italy. Now, the real story of the march on Rome is much, much more complicated. It's not really much of a march. They never really get to Rome. It's about a political kind of capitulation, a caving in by the king. It's a much less glamorous reality than
often the case.
Yeah, than the myth that emerges. The Italian army could have stopped them at any point. The police probably could have stopped them. But the myth is what matters. The idea that, as has been proved, a far-right movement led by a charismatic leader could take this incredibly decisive action, march on the capital, and that leader could become leader of the nation. It must have been an intoxicating example that, here is the roadmap, here is the blueprint. And people are saying in 1923, Germany has a Mussolini and his name is Adolf Hitler.
But one of the things that's interesting about the way that the putsch plays out, isn't it, is that in that sense, Hitler falls for the myth of Mussolini in thinking that it was that easy and that glamorous, and that if he just replicates exactly the same thing, events will work out that way, right? But actually, because it was messier, because conditions are always messier, it was messier in Germany too, and when he tried it, it didn't work out the same way.
This is myth on top of myth, and it shows the power of people reinventing their history in the aftermath. The plan for the beer hall putsch, and I'm doing air quotes because it slightly glamorizes it.
Okay, plan is generous.
Yeah. I mean, it ain't great. The idea is they're going to use conservative Bavaria as a base to gather anti-democratic forces and right-wing forces in the army, in the paramilitary groups, in the Freikorps, and they would copy Mussolini's blueprint and they would march on Berlin, depose the national government, and at some point, somehow, Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany.
By magic.
Yeah.
Same way it worked for Mussolini.
It is not a detailed plan. It is back of an envelope would be to glamorize it. It's called a putsch, which is a slang for a coup. But just thinking about numbers again, I mean, this is a party of 55,000 members. It's got a few thousand members of its paramilitary group, the SA, and Germany is a state of 62 million people. One of the central ideas in this so-called plan is a dumb idea that you see in many failed revolutions and failed coups, and it is that the people, or our people, or the army, or somebody will join our ranks, that we'll start marching, and by the time we get there, everyone will have joined us, and our ranks will have been swelled by our supporters and people who will have seen the light and joined us.
Not only is it not really a plan, it's just based on wishful thinking, right? That you just think, okay, well, our message is so self-evidently fabulous that everybody's going to want to join our party and come along. And this is not the only coup in history that failed on that basis, that didn't quite get the support in droves that it thought it was going to get.
I think one of the lessons of history, and I don't want to give advice to would-be revolutionaries here, but if you're in a beer keller or a back room and you're planning a coup, and the person in charge says, and at this point, the people will join us.
The people will rise.
Get the hell out. Go to bed and hide, or get on a plane or something, because that is just the absolute hallmark of a coup that's about to fail. It's the idea behind the Jacobite rebellion in 1745 in Britain, when a Scottish army tries to invade England. And, closer to...
I shouldn't laugh at that, but...
It was, well, part of it was pretty laughable. It was pretty terrible. It was the idea behind the Harper's Ferry incident in Virginia in 1859, the dream, beautiful dream really, that a revolution in Virginia might lead to the enslaved people of the South rising up and liberating themselves from American slavery.
This is some of us are more sympathetic to the coup at Harper's Ferry, but it cannot be denied that it didn't work out any better.
No, it didn't work out. The great John Brown great passionate abolitionist, not the great planner of coups. It's the idea behind the gunpowder plot. That once you blow up Parliament, then all of your supporters are going to rise and you're going to be able to take over. Not that you're going to be crushed by the army or that the forces of power will be able to regroup. You will get the support of the people. It's the idea behind the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba
it absolutely
in
is,
1961. Yeah. It is the touch of death to an attempted coup. And it's exactly what Hitler and his supporters think is going to take place.
So let's get to the putsch itself. It takes place on November 8th because Hitler has decided that given that von Kahr is speaking, and he is the most, popular, most powerful leader in Munich at the time, he's going to have big crowds. So Hitler decides that's where we should go.
Yeah, von Kahr has arranged to speak to his supporters at a place called the Bürger Braukeller, which is probably the biggest of Munich's beer kellers. These are these huge, they're like pubs, but they're like...
giant, like a warehouse, like a pub in a warehouse.
Yeah. They've got, some of them can fit thousands of people in. They're on kind of multiple layers. And it's where Munich society goes and gathers in the summer and they drink beer and they talk and there's tables. It's a real Bavarian tradition. These are also the places in which many of these meetings by Hitler, by the other far-right movements have been taking place. Hitler has spoken there in the past.
And this is why he's known as the beer hall agitator, because this is literally what he's doing.
Yeah. These are ready-made auditoriums. These are places where you can gather lots of people. You can also apply them with beer, which does help.
Which helps, yeah. Beer comes into the story, doesn't it?
There is alcohol is a feature of the beer hall putsch. The name is a bit of a giveaway. Von Kahr has gathered together the newspaper editors, the leaders of Bavaria's biggest companies, the bankers, his supporters, and a very large number of the political elite of Bavaria are gathered in the Bürger Braukeller that evening. There's around 3,000 people in the room that night.
And it's worth reminding everybody that although we describe these people as newspaper editors and the leaders of, the biggest companies in the region, because of hyperinflation, these are all people themselves who, on paper are billionaires, but they can barely afford the beer that they're about to buy. And so everybody is sharing the same grievance.
Yeah. Germany is a nation in which people are billionaires, but they can't afford a loaf of bread. It's absolutely ridiculous financial situation. So there's deep, deep grievances. Hitler seizes upon this moment because the three most powerful men in Bavaria are all going to be there. Bavaria is ruled not just by Gustav von Kahr, but by a triumvirate, three men. There's also the general Otto Hermann von Lossow, who is loosely speaking the head of the army in Bavaria, and Hans Ritter von Seisser, who is the head of the state police. And critical to Hitler's plan is being able to take control, to capture these men and other Bavarian politicians. Around 7 o'clock that evening, the crowd gathers to hear von Kahr. The speeches start, and then around 8:30, Hitler arrives with 600 members of his paramilitary SA. They surround the beer hall. There is not many police outside, which is something historians have debated about ever since. The SA block the entrances. They also bring in a machine gun, I presume a Maxim gun, an MG08, one of the weapons used in the Western Front. And Hitler walks into the foyer with his supporters, with his entourage. He has a beer. Hitler is not yet given up alcohol.
So he's been sitting in the beer garden, getting ready for the coup. But first, let's have a pint. Priorities, and then gather your 600 men, and they march into this huge hall full of people and announce that nobody can leave, right?
That's right. They march in. Obviously, the crowd erupts. There's cacophony
Mayhem.
of noise. Yeah. Hitler silences the crowd by firing his pistol into the air. He makes his way onto the stage where von Kahr was speaking. He tells the crowd that the revolution has begun. The government, the German government, has been deposed. And he claims that the army barracks and the police courts have all been occupied. Now, none of this is true. This is all wishful. You called it earlier wish thinking. This is wishful thinking.
How much of it does he think is true, and how much is he trying to just kind of bluff his way in, do you think?
Trying to read the mind.
A little bit of both.
We have to, because we have to try to make sense of what on earth was going through his head. But I think there's bluff, but there's also delusion. I think there's always the combination of those two when dealing with such a strange figure. He then takes Kahr, Losso, and Seisser into a side room, and he takes them there at gunpoint. This is around 8:45. And he tells them of his plan for the march on Berlin. Now, they are people who themselves have considered marching against the civilian government in Berlin. They are politically sympathizers with Hitler.
But they are also the political leaders. And so for him to come in and say, well, this is what we're going to do. And they're kind of like, no, we're the ones in charge here.
But Hitler's the one with the gun.
Hitler's the one with the gun in the room.
Which is the key difference. He says that he's going to install himself as leader. He promises Carr, Losso, and Seisser that if they go along with things, they'll become members of this new far-right government. And he warns them that he's got 4 bullets in his pistol. 3 for them if they refuse, and 1 for himself.
This is a bit of a theme for Adolf, isn't it? He's going to do this for the rest of his career. He likes to threaten suicide.
There's a lot of talk about suicide in this story. And remember, Hitler is somebody who does die by suicide. It is fascinating how often it comes up. But after he is at gunpoint forced Carr, Losso, and Seisser to agree to join the putsch, they go back into the main beer hall and they address the crowd. Now, he left Goering on stage, Hermann Goering, the future leader of the Luftwaffe, on stage to try to sort of keep the crowd happy while he'd been away.
Goering told them to have a beer, didn't he?
Yeah, Goering said, what's your problem?
You've got a beer?
You've got a beer. What's the problem? I mean, you're pointing a machine gun at us as part of the problem. But Hitler goes on stage, relieves Goering, who's kind of pretty terrible warm-up act. And around this time, Erich von Ludendorff arrives. Now, this is a national hero. This is somebody who Hitler has persuaded. The only real political figure, the only real national figure Hitler has persuaded to join the putsch. Ludendorff had led the German army. He'd been the leader, the commander of the entire German army.
So when Hitler was a corporal, he was serving under Ludendorff.
Yeah. It is astonishing that a corporal and the leader of the German army appear on stage together. Ludendorff arrives in
5 years.
Yeah.
5 years after the end of the war,
Yeah.
the corporal and the general appear on stage together.
Yeah. And, Hitler had been a messenger between the trenches, a relatively lowly position. He'd never become an officer. This is a man who had been virtual dictator of Germany for the last years of the war. He arrives in his full general's uniform, the uniform of the former Reich, the Kaiserreich, a nation that doesn't exist, but he's wearing this uniform. It's difficult to explain just how famous and how influential, how respected a figure Ludendorff is. And he declares his support for the putsch and Hitler's march on Berlin. And then von Kahr, who'd been dragged back on stage with Ludendorff, shakes hands with Hitler. He's just had a gun pointed at him to persuade him to take part in this putsch. But in front of the crowd, he publicly states his support.
So it looks like the official seal of approval. He shakes the man's hand.
Yeah.
It looks like a deal has been struck.
Yeah. He does so in the context of a speech that Hitler gives. I said earlier that there's no point us pretending that Hitler did not have talents, and his talent as a public speaker was astonishing. There's mixed accounts, no really official account of what Hitler said from the stage of the Burger Braukeller that night. But a crowd that had just been threatened with machine guns and rifles and pistols ended up giving cheers and effusive praise to Hitler, the man who had just threatened them. He condemned the Jewish government in Berlin. He called them the November criminals, which is the phrase for the people who'd signed the Treaty of Versailles. He spoke to their deepest grievances and turned them around. There is a moment here when the entire audience is behind this crazy idea of the putsch. And for that moment, it really must have felt like this was going to work.
Yeah. So he thinks at this point, he's done it.
Yeah.
He's succeeded.
And this is as good as it gets.
It's all downhill from here.
Yeah.
We do get to enjoy Hitler's downfalls. I mean, we are allowed to do that, aren't we?
Yeah, if only this was
exactly the full
definitive
one. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It is, as you say, downhill from this point, because almost immediately it starts to turn into a farce. The beer hall putsch is actually a tale of two beer halls. There's another one involved. This is the Löwenbräu-Keller, and around 2,000 members of the SA are there. They're there with Ernst Röhm, who's the leader of the SA, who's going to die later, be killed by Hitler in the so-called Night of the Long Knives. At 9 p.m., the message is sent from the Bürger Braukeller that the putsch has been launched. And that is the signal for Röhm to send the SA across Munich, and they're going to seize control of all of these key ministerial military police buildings.
But they're also still drinking in these two beer halls. So there's a lot of drinking going on as well. I mean, we said earlier, it's not really a plan. They dispense the people, but it's not a well-oiled machine.
I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous. Not only have they been drinking, this plan relies on this principle, this dream that everyone's going to join in. The army and the police are going to go, yes, we're with you on this putsch. And that's just not what happens. The local soldiers and the Munich police, in some cases who know the putschists, the Nazis, the SA, they end up having conversations with them. There are these encounters and these confrontations outside key buildings, but for the most part, people are unwilling to use force. So you have these strange standoffs where buildings are kind of half occupied, or people get there and rather than there being a takeover, there's a bit of a negotiation. There's lots of people standing around, a lot of people pointing guns at each other, but not that much violence.
And Hitler thinks he has deposed certain parts of the government that are actually still there in charge.
Yeah. From the Bürger Braukeller, Hitler thinks this plan is working and these buildings are being seized. They're not being seized, and soldiers and police aren't joining the putsch for one very simple reason. There had been an outbreak of violence. Around 10:30, Hitler had left the Bürger Braukeller to deal with a clash between the SA and German army soldiers at a barracks of the engineers in Munich. And he had left Ludendorff in charge of are they prisoners or are they co-revolutionaries? Kahr, Seisser and Lossow. Ludendorff decides to let them go. He is convinced.
What could possibly go wrong?
it's just laughable. It's hard to see why Germany loses the First World War with this sort of leadership. He is convinced that because they have now said they support the putsch, that they wouldn't dream of going back on their word. These are German gentlemen. These are officers. Their word is their bond. They're not going to change sides.
Even though it was extracted from them at gunpoint.
Yeah.
So it's not really their word. It was just, saving their skin.
And the moment that they get out of the Bürger Braukeller, the moment they haven't got a gun in their face, they immediately change sides and they immediately start to crush the putsch.
And when we say immediately, it's within moments, hours.
Yeah, they go to police stations. They get on the phone. They have a proclamation printed. Posters are pasted all over Munich, making clear their intention to put down the putsch and also making clear that anyone who joins it will be guilty of treason. Democratic Weimar Germany, after the First World War, had abolished the death penalty, but the penalty for treason was still life in prison. You're not going to join a coup with that potential penalty unless you're sure it's going to work. And there's nothing about Hitler and the SA that looks like that's going to work.
Right. It looks like a complete shambles, right? So this is actually one of the few moments in Hitler's rise, isn't it, where a government actually acted decisively.
This is what democracies are supposed to do when faced with a coup. This is what happens in 1923, and it's the reason why it doesn't end with the beginning of a Third Reich, and it's not what happens in 1933. Lossow telephoned the army headquarters, which was supposedly under the control of Röhm and the SA, and troops who are loyal to the Bavarian government are transported to Munich. They get on the radio and they announce that this is an illegal coup, and they again say anyone who supports it is guilty of treason. And news starts coming into the Bürger Braukeller that this isn't working. By 5 a.m., the situation is absolutely desperate. Hitler has no idea what to do, and as a result, no orders are issued.
Well, this has been the problem, right? As we said, there's no plan. Hitler doesn't have a strategy. What he has is the ability to work up the crowd. And so that's kind of what he tries to do, isn't it? Is he just he falls back on what he knows, which is grandstanding, which is the big dramatic gesture.
Yeah, he can win over 3,000 people in the Bürger Braukeller with his oratory, but he can't change the events that are happening out on the street. He can't change the telegrams and the information moving around the Bavarian government and the German government. And the forces of the state have moved to crush this coup, this putsch. And so Hitler, his supporters, the SA, are in the Bürger Braukeller. There's a mountain of bread rolls and uneaten food and stale beer.
Party's over.
And they're trying to work out what to do. Hitler, as ever, is saying, let's fight to the death. He's always...
Right, grandstanding.
It's the suicide thing again. Yeah. It's death or glory. The only decision made during the night of the 8th of November was to send a detachment of the SA to one of the thousands of printing presses that were printing money in this year of hyperinflation, and they steal armfuls of 50 billion mark notes. That shows how bad the inflation is. There is
50 billion.
50 billion. And they give them out to the SA troops, so the stormtroopers. So they've been paid. It's important to remember at this point, no one has been killed. This is a bloodless coup so far. Shots have been fired. There's been shots fired by Hitler into the ceiling of the Burger Keller. There had been a clash in which shots had been fired between the SA and the army, but no blood had been spilled.
Well, that's going to change, isn't it? Because there is the second day of the beer hall putsch still to come. So join us next time as we hear how it all unraveled, but also how it set the stage for one of history's most catastrophic comebacks. Join us next time.
And thanks for listening.